Alright folks, today I'm going to be showing you how I made the Steel Greatsword from Skyrim, which is this thing from this game. Now I'm going to educate you a little bit here. This thing's actually not a greatsword, not in historical context. If you compare it to, say, a Nord, let's say every Nord in the game is 6 feet tall. If we compare this weapon to him, it comes out to about 5 feet in length. Now the length is not necessarily the determining factor to tell the difference between whether a sword is a greatsword or whether it's a longsword. But based on its size and proportion to the Nord or anyone carrying it, I believe that's actually a longsword, not a greatsword. If you want a more in-depth video on how to tell a greatsword from a longsword, I recommend this video by Shadiversity. He made that video quite some time ago, but even so, it's still pretty good, and I learned a lot from it. And I might at some point make my own version of that video. But anyway, let's get to the prop I made now. So starting with the blade, that part at its base level was made of 2 layers of 10mm foam. Its length in relation to its width and thickness is pretty disproportionate, so it needs some kind of internal support. And for this kind of a prop, that's simple. You just need a rod of steel, which is what I used. It doesn't have to be steel though, it could be wood or aluminum. And well, some people would say that my swords are steel. That's a joke, son.
Very amusing, Mr. Film.
Okay, as I was saying, I actually cut the length of the blade a little bit too short, because despite the fact I'm Asian, I can't do math worth a damn. So to fix that issue, I just added an extension, another piece of 2 layers of 10mm foam. Now that the blade was at the right length, finally, it was time to get it in shape. To cut the tip into shape, I used my trusty bandsaw, and for smoothing everything down, I used the Dremel. Now to make the blade the shape of an actual blade, first thing I did was cut the tip like this to give it a taper. And if you don't know what a taper is, all the definition of the more vague words will all be in the video description. Anyway, for the tip taper, I just cut that using my box knife, and I used that same knife to cut all the edge bevels. Cutting something in this fashion with a box knife makes cuts that are quite a bit rougher than if you cut them with, say, a bandsaw. But regardless, I still had to smooth it down again with the Dremel. Now this part, the tip, is the only sensitive part of the whole thing. Wow, that sounded like I'm talking about something else. But because of the fact that it's fragile, I encased the whole thing in Worbla, definition and description by the way, molded it into shape and cut off the excess. So now the whole blade is in proper shape, and it was time to work my way down a little bit. So the next part to do were these things. These are the secondary Quillins. Definition in video description. These things were also 2 layers of 10mm foam, and were cut to shape using the bandsaw, and these pieces were also given a taper. Then it was just a matter of gluing them onto the side of the blade, right at the part where it stopped being sharp. So the next thing to do was to wrap this on, and my gosh, it really sounds like I'm talking about something else. But this was the leather grip for the second handle, and for that I just used a layer of 2mm foam. And to add some detail and immersion to the thing, I added more pieces of 2mm foam that acted as the leather lacings on the second handle. Now the last thing to do in order to finish the blade was all of this little detail work on the secondary Quillins. It all started with just a piece of 2mm foam, and all those little tiny engravings, I first had to draw those with a Sharpie, and then cut out the parts I drew with an X-Acto knife. And you very well may guess that took some time to do. So much so that some people would probably draw the line at that point. That's a joke too, son!
Phelps, you mind if I shoot this guy? He's getting on my nerves.
All that was left to do was to actually glue it onto the blade itself. And no problem with that, it was pretty easy. But upon finishing, the whole blade was done at that point. And now with the blade done, it was time to move on to the hilt, namely this part of the hilt, the guard. That piece was 3 layers of 10mm foam, and was also cut to shape using the bandsaw. And was also smoothed down with the Dremel. No surprise there. And the engravings were done the exact same way as before. I drew them on with a Sharpie first, then cut all those pieces out with an X-Acto knife, all on a piece of 2mm foam. And after gluing those pieces on, there was also some detail engravings to do on the top and the bottom of the guard. Those were done using the exact same method. And after completing that and adding the guard to the blade, the next thing to do was the handle. The handle itself is also 2 layers of 10mm foam, and to make the thing more comfortable to hold, I rounded off all the corners with the Dremel. That might seem a little unnecessary, but there's no cutting corners in cosplay. Ha-ha!
Let me shoot this guy, please.
The leather lacings were done the exact same way as the secondary handle, and now the very last thing to do was the pommel. You know, the thing that ends your foes rightly. No, there's a real historical purpose for it. Definition is in the description. Like the guard, this thing at its base level was 3 layers of 10mm foam, and it actually has bevels on it. Those were just cut off using my box knife and smoothed with the Dremel as always. And of course, the engravings were done the exact same way as before. As for that little spherical part, I didn't want to go through the trouble of actually making a sphere, so I just used an already made styrofoam sphere instead. And by the way, in case you don't know, the foam I use for my props is not styrofoam, it's actually called EVA foam. It's the same kind of stuff you see in those puzzle piece floor mats or cheap flip-flops. But with that done, and the engraving layer glued on, the pommel was done, and after adding that to the rest of the sword, the entire sword was done. At least in terms of construction, I still had to paint it, of course. So with the construction done, the next thing to do was to prime it, and the primer is the same thing that I always use, 2 coats of Plastidip. As far as the paint job goes, this was pretty easy for that. All of the leather parts were given 3 coats of dark brown, and all the metal parts were given 1 coat of metallic silver. And after all the base paint was done, the very last thing to do were the highlights. I added some highlights on the silver parts, namely like on the edges of the guard and also the ridge on the blade. But the ones that really make this thing stand out were all the highlights on the leather lacings. And my gosh, what a difference that makes. And we're done. The steel longsword is finished. I'm usually not super proud of my work, because whenever I make something there's always a few flaws on it, but that's kind of inevitable anyways. However, this one I was actually really pleased with. I didn't want to make like Elsa and let it go, but no, somebody paid for it and I had to ship it out. If you would like me to make one of these for you, there is a link in the video description that will take you to my Etsy shop. From there, you can just go ahead and order it, or contact me and we'll go from there. And hey, I'm always open to suggestions too for future videos, and also how to make them better. And the best way to get those to me at the moment is through the comment section. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch my video. And hey, more subscriptions are always nice, but that is entirely up to you. That is going to do it for now, guys, and I will see you guys in the next build.